Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, August 25th, and what's on your mind? What do you want to talk about today? What wisdom do you have for us?
Oh, I don't know if I would call any of it wisdom, but who knows? Let's let the viewers be the judge. A little bit of everything. Uh, the ongoing battle in the Donbass, the economic fragility here in the West. All those things, and developments in the Middle East. Um, I don't know. Let's just start with Gaza very quickly because I just wanted to mention that I've been reading reports that, more than that, clear evidence that Hamas is beginning to cave in, to Israeli demands, not just Israeli demands, but the Arab states that have been working as mediators, Egypt and Qatar in particular. They had rejected actually an Israeli offer for a partial ceasefire. They rejected it a couple months ago, and insisting on a full settlement. They wanted to have, with good reason, some sort of guarantee that the Israelis wouldn't break the ceasefire and renew the war. And that's something that the Israelis weren't willing to promise. But now they're actually accepting, have accepted the deal that they rejected a couple months ago. But the Israelis are now trying to, add new conditions to that. So it's clear to me that, well, first of all, Hamas is weakening, and it's, I think it's obvious why. First, they have fewer hostages to deal. Those were their bargaining chips. Um, Hostages are prisoners of war, um, and they also they're facing this operation, this plan to completely level Gaza City, and and then there's the ongoing starvation. All of these things, are they realize that there's really not much they can do to prevent them. There was hope that they would get some pressure, like maybe through the Trump administration, to have the Israelis hold off on this operation. Gideon's chariots too, but Trump has approved it, and again we're talking about 1.2 million people. They just don't have any cards to play at this point. It just seems they don't have the support that they were hoping to get from external forces, and their people are suffering so terribly, and there's one of their main strongholds was in Gaza City, and it looks like the Israelis are going to go ahead and level it. It will take months to do this, to evacuate. First of all, the residents, that's supposed to be the first stage, and those who refuse will be, forcibly, will either end up under the rubble or will just be driven out by artillery fire. That's what they're faced with. So it just, again, looks very, very grim all around. Um,
If Hamas does release all the hostages and is exiled, because this is what they always say when you talk with Zionists, they're just like, well, all Hamas has to do is just release the hostages and this is all over. Do you believe that it would be all over if they just said, okay, fine, here's all the hostages and Hamas goes to Egypt or something?
right.
Does anybody actually believe that Israel will just remove itself from Gaza?
Well, maybe some people believe it. I don't. They're going to stay in Gaza. Maybe again they'll leave part of Gaza. Already, again, a very densely populated area prior to October 7th. But they will not. I don't think they're ever going to withdraw from much of Gaza. There's talk of a buffer zone, which would be something like 22-25% of all of Gaza. That I think the Israelis are already saying they would insist on. So, again, a small area reduced by 25%. That's a huge loss to the Gazans. But I think they're going to take more. There's a great deal of pressure within Israeli society to reintroduce settlers there. They were the last settlers left in 2005, and now the Israelis are saying that was a mistake. So I think we're going to see new settlements probably in the north. Um, and
I
then,
just
and but that's sort of like the rosier scenario, and it just may be they continue with the ethnic cleansing. We've seen this happen before. Oh, there's a safe place in the south, but then that safe place it turns out, not to be so safe. Again, families are killed in their tents by missiles and bombs. And I think there remain plans to, relocate the Gazans to other countries. I don't know if that will ever happen, but I think there are clearly efforts underway to achieve that.
So do you think that Hamas will actually make some type of deal with Israel? They'll be forced to, and what would that deal look like? And what would it mean for Hamas, for Gaza, for Israel?
Yeah. Well, they just may be forced to. I mean, again, it's just like they've run out of cards to play, and like you're saying, they just may be forced to essentially to capitulate, to accede to the Israeli demands.
So what are we saying?
So
All
yes,
hostages
Hamas,
released.
right?
Hamas leaves.
Hamas leaves for Egypt, and then there's a Palestinian Authority, that's reinstated me with support from neighboring Arab states, possibly. But, again, I think we just don't know. That may be what they agree to, but who knows what the Israelis will actually allow. The Israelis say, they're going to they're going to have this buffer zone. They're going to maintain, control over the Philadelphia corridor, again, in contravention of the treaty that they had with Egypt. And again, they've already leveled Rafah, Khan Yunis, major cities within Gaza, and now the largest one of all they're planning to level. So it's just going to be a pile of rubble, and with this population pushed into an ever smaller area. Is this something that can really last? Are they, even if you begin to, their infrastructure, their hospitals have just been, absolutely devastated. There's very little, remaining functioning infrastructure. I think something like 60 desalination plants have been destroyed. So it's just the crisis, even if the war stops and food starts to flow, this humanitarian crisis is going to continue.
Do you think that Hamas should capitulate and go into? I mean, I would say the reason to do it is, well, first of all, maybe you can get some temporary relief just to keep people alive, because
Right.
we're talking about famine, mass starvation, and then also, okay, sure, you release it, you don't have any cards to play. They haven't really had any cards anyways. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. It seems like with the hostages, they bargained. They got some Palestinian hostages back, sure, but overall, just Israel will break the deal and continue doing what it's doing. So I don't even know
Right.
how much it means. But if you
Right.
give up the hostages, then all of a sudden, the argument that all the Zionists are making is just all about the hostages is over.
Right.
You can't say
Right.
it's about that anymore. They're just like, oh, all Palestine, all Gaza has to do, all the Hamas has to do is let go of the hostages. They're gone. Hamas is gone. What are you doing in Gaza? Get out of there. Okay. So I almost feel like that would be the right choice to make, because I don't believe that Israel will stop what it's doing. They may slow down temporarily to let aid in because of all this pressure around this agreement, but it's just a matter of time before we just see them continue doing what they're doing, or there's just so much hatred that's built in there already that I don't think it can stop. So I just feel like we know that Hamas is just this boogeyman that they kind of create. It's not Hamas. You're attacking the people. So I don't know, I think maybe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, you may be right. I mean, it's in a way, I can understand their reluctance to do it, but I think they're reaching that conclusion too. I think they're headed that way, that they just don't have any choice, and just to save the people that remain there. Before they did have some cards, or at least some hope that they did. They had, we'll say the prisoners of war and hostages, and a number of them. And then, they had at least some reason to believe that the U.S., especially remember at the beginning of Trump's term, he seemed to have supported the ceasefire, but the Americans proved to be as treacherous as the Israelis. And so now I think they're seeing that. They were hoping to get Trump back on board, and, he made some maybe encouraging noises at various points, but it's clear now that, no, he's solidly, in working in cahoots with the Israelis. There's really no daylight between them. And I think they recognize that. So, what can they do? I mean, that's the sad reality. And then you just think, it's a horrible thing to say. Again, it's obviously a crime to forcibly relocate these people, to ethnically cleanse them, and send them to another country. But my goodness, if I were a Gazan, I would just think, I don't care. I just want to get out of here. I mean, it's again, it's a horror. It's not wrong, but this is what we're faced with. Nobody's doing anything, giving them. If the choice is that we're all just going to die here, or I'll end up in South Sudan, maybe I say, well, I get my family to South Sudan. Maybe I can get them out of there, or maybe I can start a new life there, but I just can't live here. That's it. This is wrong. Clearly it's wrong, but that's the unjust reality that we're looking at.
Right. You know what I would like to see happen, and tell me if you think this is at all possible, is that Iran issues an ultimatum to Israel. I was listening to a podcast with Max Blumenthal and an Iranian woman on the Gray Zone earlier, and it was quite interesting just to kind of get an insight into Iranian society. And it seems like for the most part, the Iranians believe that they should have kept going, that they were ready to keep the fight going, and just how unified the people came. Even people that were progressive and kind of against the Ayatollah, not really, they were more progressive, liberal Iranians. They were become unified, and they're all like, when it started happening, they were looking at each other's neighbors like, "Is that Israel? We got to stand together. We got to fight back." So. And they don't look at this as a 12-day war. They look at this as the first 12 days. They all know that this is going to continue, that this is going to go on. So when they have that mindset, you don't want to just give Israel and the United States the opportunity to gear up and prepare for its one powerful punch, in the beginning, and then you're allowed to start striking back. Instead, why don't they issue an ultimatum to Israel and say, Israel, you have to pull out of Gaza immediately, or we will intervene militarily. We are striking. We'll give you a warning. This gives them, the sort of the moral impetus to start the war, in the eyes of the world, because the world wants to see this happen. The world wants to see a military intervention to stop a genocide. I mean, if there's any reason to have a military intervention, this is the one, right? I mean, we're seeing the genocide of a people. If they do that, I think it would have overwhelming support around the world. Israel will probably, of course, dismiss it and call it just this saber rattling from Iran, and then probably try to attack Iran first, or get the United States to attack Iran, because we know that's what they're doing. They're preparing for an attack to attack Iran when they have the right window of opportunity. So don't give them that chance. You can take a moral position here, and to help end the genocide, and to deal with Israel's severe blow without potentially causing the U.S. to come in immediately, full on, or whatever it is, because this war is happening, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I can see your point. It would be, they're between a rock and a hard place. It would be a risky action again to reignite the war, and there's no guarantees that things are going to go well for Iran.
Well, you're not reigniting it. You're saying if you don't pull out of Gaza, which everybody's saying that, or let aid in some condition to say, keep these. You can't starve people to death.
Right. Yeah. No. I see the point, but it could lead to war, because Israel is unlikely to comply.
It's going to lead to war anyways.
Yeah. No, I understand. But it's just it. Again, you're the head of a state, and you're putting the existence of your country. I know. You say you don't do something, you're at risk, but you do something, and then you've got to take the blame. And I'm sure the Iranians also have to take. I know they do have to take into account what their allies, their supporters, like in Russia and China, for example, are telling them. Maybe they're probably hearing them. Emphasize caution. They're probably pushing a cautious approach. Maybe we can work this out. But realistically, that's the cautious approach might not be the smart approach, and maybe they do have to, do what you say. I don't think it's an absurd. It would be an absurd move on the part of Iran by any stretch. Also, I just wanted to add, I saw that same podcast they were referring to, or, a good part of it. One thing that she pointed out too was that it was not just, liberals that are, pro-Western, but those who were maybe a certain kind of nationalist within Iran who didn't see the point of supporting the axis of resistance. Why are we in there in Syria wasting money in these different now they said when Israel attacked them and they woke up to the sounds of explosions in Tehran, they said, "Oh, this is real."
Right.
And
They
and
understood.
actually Syria was a buffer state that was protecting us. And now, that it's fallen, the Israelis are here on our own soil. And then, yeah, like you say, there's a real unity of purpose and support for Iran and its government. Yeah, I haven't seen anything to contradict that. It just seems clear that the effect, which I think is predictable, of the Israeli attack was to not to lead to regime change, but really quite the opposite.
Right. No, I just feel like there is a great opportunity here for members of the BRICS, people that are not captive to the U.S. empire, to become a moral power, because there is a moral vacuum in the world now because of what we're doing in Gaza. The West was supposed to be all about morality, and we were supposed to look at states like China and Iran and Russia as evil. It's all getting turned upside down. People are judging the morality of a people in a country by their position in Gaza now. So if you, as a state, China, everybody's talks about China as this horrible authoritarian communist state. If China takes this position and says, like, okay, we are sanctioning Israel, not even engaging militarily, or doing whatever it can, flexing its incredible economic muscle around the world to put pressure on Israel, they would become heroes around the world. All of a sudden, that everybody talking around the West about just how evil and terrible and authoritarian China is, they think that image will be abolished. For the most part, I believe. So I just don't understand. Even from your own self-interest, it is in the self-interest of all these countries around the world to take a strong stance here. In the face of obvious pure evil, take a stance. Really do something. Stop it. End it. You'll be heroes. That's why the Houthis are the greatest moral power in the world, because they're the only ones that are doing anything. And Iran, Iran is like number 2 now in a sense, but it has, and I feel like the Iranians realize that, and that's why they want to keep it going, because they know that this is a just fight for them. So they want to. I think the Iranian people want to do it, and I think this is the only thing we need. The world needs this. The world needs somebody to stand up to Israel, and if you do that, boom, you're you're standing amongst the everyday people around the world is going to skyrocket. Right. So do it, countries.
Well, I can't disagree with you. I'm trying to think of reasons to disagree with you, or to point out your naivete, but maybe I'm just as naive as you are. I think that's the right thing to do. And not just right, because it is morally right, but also it could, actually be very much to the benefit of every country involved in such an effort, including China.
Yeah, I think the problem is with so many countries, the state is so bureaucratic. It's just hard to make any firm decisions and moves without some huge process. But the Houthis, on the other hand, it's just like you and your boys. Like, whoa, did you see that? That's messed up. Let's get the boys together. We're going to stop this.
Yeah.
That's kind of how they act, so they're able to move more quickly. But I just feel like these other states are just afraid to when it's clear what you should be doing here. And I'm just trying to figure out why nobody's doing anything. It's just hard.
Right. Well, I think there's often, first of all, in the case of Russia, they have their hands tied in Ukraine. That's devoting the greater part of their resources and attention. In the case of China, I think such a move just goes against long-standing policy, especially economic and trade policy. In general, they've frowned on sanctions and whatever. It's the U.S. that imposes sanctions, and we're the free trade nation. So it would be a kind of reversal to them, and there's probably a lot of bureaucratic resistance and and inertia in the case of like that. But this is so extreme. This is not like, oh, we disagree with your policy vis-a-vis, women or whatever. It's just like, you say, okay, well, the different countries do things differently. This is just an outright genocide. It's just starving children, and it's getting worse day by day. This is such an extreme example that it seems like yeah, I think in general you should resist using sanctions and punishing other countries or whatever. That's what the U.S. does. It's now sanctioning a third of the countries in the world, and often for completely, contrived and, ridiculous reasons. And China doesn't do that. But this is such an extraordinary exception. I think that they should, such an extraordinary situation that it deserves an exception. It's an extraordinary case where you can find an exception to the general rule.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are seeing support from Russia and China via them funneling weaponry into Iran. So, I mean, do you know anything about the current state of Iran's military?
I I really don't. I'll be honest with you. I'm sure they're doing something. I wish I could say, perhaps it's that kind of information is really hard to come by. There are rumors, there are reports, and you just don't know. There really haven't been any official statements. Russia hasn't gone out and said, we're sending them so many of these systems. China hasn't. But you hear reports, and I think they have to be true that, that weapon systems, especially air defense systems are coming to Iran, but I just can't confirm any of that. I can't give you any, concrete data on that.
Okay, have you heard?
I did hear just that this was an interesting thing on report on True Promise 1 and True Promise 2. If you remember, those are the demonstrative strikes that Iran carried out prior to the 12-day war, or the 12 days of war, is, however you want to put it. He said, apparently in the first one, 50% of Iranian missiles failed. And the reason is that they just used a lot of their older models. And they decided to just kind of burn through that stock. And 50% of those blew up like in the first stage. But then in True Promise 2, it was only 10% failed. And so anyway, that gives you an idea of, of kind of what, probably what happened, if anything, it was going to be even better in the case of the 12-day war. They're using more advanced systems, and apparently they have even more advanced systems that they haven't used now. Now, again, it's hard to know exactly, I don't think Iran is announcing this, like how many weapons they still have, how many launchers they have, how many were actually destroyed by Israel. It's just not clear. But if a number were destroyed, I'm sure that they're working hard to replace those now. And it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it's going to be, especially with China and Russia helping them, they'll be able to rebuild more quickly than Israel does, because we just know the constraints on air defense systems and interceptors, how limited the U.S.'s production capacity is and how depleted their stocks are. It's going to take a long time for Israel to build up its air defense again. That, again, I think the reason the war ended when it did is that they knew that they had almost just about run out. And, it'll take, you would think, several months before they can rebuild that. But if they rebuild it to where it was before, then they just have another 12 days. And if Iran knows that and they're really ready for them this time, it's going to be a different kind of war.
Right. But then, I mean, this is what we always have this discussion. It ends up like, okay, well, what happens when we know that the math is not in Israel's favor? They're going to run out of interceptors. They're going to be getting hit hard. They're a much smaller country, much smaller population. It's just a matter of time before they're like, uh-oh, what do we do? Time to start really talking about the Samson option now. And then like, okay, now we're looking at nukes, like this. And so I understand Iran's hesitation, because it's just like, you got to do this. This is going to happen. This thing seems to be inevitable. But if you do it, then the likelihood of a nuclear weapon being used in the next month or so just goes up drastically, Right. So it's
yeah. Well, that's another issue. It's like, has Iran made a decision to produce a nuclear weapon?
Do you think that would even deter Israel from using a nuclear weapon? If they're getting pummeled, I just feel like they would just be like, I don't care. We'll take us down. We're taking you down too,
And maybe, again, there are people, maybe, There are probably people that refuse to be deterred by that possibility. They just find it's and maybe have such faith, abiding faith in like the kind of the divine favors that that Israel enjoys, that they feel like they can get away with, even with that. They don't, it's wrong for them to even fear a nuclear attack. But I'm sure others are going to be cooler heads, especially in the IDF, who would say, hey, we can't do this. But
yeah,
who knows who would win that battle. In that same podcast that you mentioned, she said that, I mean, this woman academic, she said that, now she's wondering, why don't we go for a nuclear weapon?
Right. She's saying everybody's saying that.
Yeah, right. It's not just herself, but she says that's what polls are showing, is that. So, that's another factor to consider.
Who knows? They might be trying to do it right now.
They may be. They're not necessarily going to announce it.
Right. Well, okay. So then that's another thing we haven't really talked about much, is that, okay, what if Iran does build a nuke? They have a nuke. Are they now able to put pressure on Israel in a way, or will Israel just be like, well, see, we told you, now we got to bomb you? If they have a nuke, just say, okay, you're done, Israel. You got to pull back. 1967 borders, we got to respect it, ratify everything by the UN. And what's the U.S. going to do? The U.S. does it. It's like, okay, you want to start, have Iran start launching nukes because you're. I mean, the U.S. couldn't take them down anyways.
Right. Well, you can imagine the hysteria once, because there's been this hysteria that's gone on for decades about a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program that did not exist in Iran. Now, if there's an actual one, you can imagine what the hysteria is going to be.
Right. And you made it happen. You did this.
Absolutely. It's the same thing with North Korea. We made it happen. Both countries were very willing to deal and to, they look at it as a bargaining chip. Okay, we don't need to have a nuclear weapon, but we'll, give us something so that we can set this aside. And we had the JCPOA, but we know what happened to that, and that was torn up. I mean, if Iran announces it has a nuclear weapon, what is going to be the response? It may be, again, very reckless behavior on the part of Israel and the U.S. They may just launch some sort of, a full-scale air attack to try to destroy, those weapons that exist. You would think that the Iranians would be very careful and disperse the weapons that they had and make sure that, that they can't all be taken out in air raids. But we may, just the announcement they have it, rather than deter, attacks, might actually provoke an attack. I think normally that wouldn't happen, but we have such crazies. It's just like, again, in the case of North Korea, it has deterred an attack, but we don't have, any equivalent to Zionism, which has deep roots within the U.S., supporting attacks on North Korea. I think it's actually a more rational approach that we have. It's not necessarily smart or anything, but it's less emotional in the case of Korea. But in the case of Iran, we have these, real extremists and hotheads that, have real power in the country. This isn't over. Yeah.
Right.
I think she's right. It's the 12 days of war. It's not the 12-day war.
Oof. And I'm just thinking, maybe that there could be a real possibility Iran announces sometime in the future, oh, look, we got a nuclear weapon. Don't mess with us. And then, okay, what do countries like Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states do? They're like, well, okay, well, now we need one too. And this whole thing
that was always a fear. I mean, that's the reason that, for example, Russia has opposed, and I think Iran too, it's not like they really wanted to start off, but they've been backed into a corner where they're, the existence of their nation has been, put into question. And so it's in this, so they may very well decide to go for it, even if, they see the downside to it.
If we want to avoid all this, I mean, the easy, also just rational decision for me to say is for all the countries that are part of the NPT that have nuclear weapons, it should be like, well, we have one country here that has nuclear weapons that's not part of the NPT. If that country uses a nuclear weapon, then there's an agreement from all of us, nuclear-powered weapons, that the punishment is you get nuked. You're not allowed to do this. You can't, you know what I mean? I mean, okay, maybe it sounds extreme, but it's not extreme because we're talking about them using nuclear weapons because they're not supposed to have them. and they're threatening
Right.
the world with them.
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
just
Well, yeah.
provide
Part of the reason,
security.
right.
The other nuclear weapons, nuclear countries, they should provide security to the rest of the world by making that type of promise.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they can do that, but you're right to point to the NPT and actually the IAEA. That just part of the reason that we are where we are is the complete failure of the IAEA to really perform its functions. Again, it's been working for Israel, which is in violation. Is not a signatory to the NPT, to constantly, to pressure and really persecute, Iran and manufacture, all kinds of excuses for attacking Iran, completely manufactured, without basis. They have failed so miserably. And again, as I pointed out, it's just the fact that these nuclear scientists, civilian nuclear scientists, were assassinated with their families. And then the IAEA couldn't, these are the kind of people that they should be speaking up for. These are their, essentially their colleagues. But they just couldn't do it. And it just shows a complete failure. And the Russians have been very critical of them, too, because, we've seen something similar, actually, within Ukraine, with all the attacks on nuclear power plants by the Ukrainians. And there's just a failure of the IAEA, to do what it's supposed to do and to prevent these kind of things and to speak out against them and provide pressure. It just doesn't. It excuses the perpetrators and doesn't defend the victims. And again, that's part of the reason, like the Iranians said, we try to do everything. We've actually bent over backwards. Again, I think I mistakenly said earlier, it was like 3 times the amount of inspections had been imposed on Iran. It was 7 times.
Right,
It's just like it's way out of proportion. Again, Iran bent over backwards and has been subjected to the most intrusive, even, outside of the JCPOA, just the most intrusive and extensive inspections in any country in the world. And they just try to do everything to satisfy them, all kinds of unreasonable demands, and they've done everything. And then in the end, it didn't do them any good. This is a failure of the IAEA. That's part of the reason, that we're where we are, why we're here. But then you say, why is the IAEA failed? And it's because it has been corrupted by, like so many international institutions, by American-led Western hegemony. They got their guy in there. It was Grossi in this case. There was Baradei, back in the early 2000s, or, up through roughly 2010, I guess a little beyond that. He actually tried to be balanced. Even he, because he was under so much pressure, sometimes acceded to their, unreasonable demands. But he tried to actually be balanced and go by the rules and, perform the function that the IAEA was supposed to function. But that angered the Americans and the Israelis. So they got their guy in there. First, they had this Japanese who, it was revealed by WikiLeaks, said, yeah, I'll do what you want. And now they've got Grossi. Yeah, I mean, if you want to say why, point a finger, it's like, who's to blame for this? Pointed at the IAEA, pointed at Israel and the U.S. and all those Western powers that have gone along with it. Again, the Europeans could actually be an independent power and work against this and but they never do. There was some hope among the Iranians that after the JCPOA failed, after the Americans pulled out of it, that the Europeans would try to keep up their side of the bargain. But it was essentially, well, now that the Americans are out, we might get in trouble by, actually trading and dealing with the Iranians. So they kind of essentially reimpose sanctions. Say, what was the point of this? That's it again, the Iranians. We're trying to do this, live by these treaties. It doesn't matter. It doesn't seem to matter at all. So, they're probably, I'm sure there are people arguing, and they've maybe already won the argument within Iran. Let's just go for the nuclear weapon. This is just silly to think that we can ever reach an agreement. Now, Pezeshkian, the president, he's been very naive, but, maybe he's woken up. And, but he doesn't necessarily make the decisions. There are a lot of power centers within Iran.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll see. Maybe Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and then that changes just the whole game. So we're looking. I mean, we started talking about this because we're looking at solutions to end the Gaza genocide, and we said that potentially the war between Iran and Israel starts back up, and it puts pressure on Israel, and they're no longer able to continue it. Although, well, we saw the war, that 12-day war was going on. They kind of escalated their operations in Gaza. So, it's kind of a two-edged sword with that one. Yeah. Or Iran can potentially get a nuclear weapon. I don't see any chance of the United States pulling out support, unfortunately. Are there any other solutions to save Gaza? I mean, an uprising in Jordan, West Bank, Egypt, anything from Lebanon?
No, I mean, again, unfortunately, it's just like the traditional. Hezbollah has been greatly weakened. It's really fighting for its own survival in Lebanon. There are efforts, very powerful efforts to disarm Hezbollah. I think, they're not willing to do that. There's a risk of civil war there. In the West Bank, the West Bank has seen an acceleration of their settlements and in general, the dispossession of the Palestinian people there. And there's currently, a plan that I think is already being implemented to essentially cut the West Bank in half, to just create this, this corridor right through the middle that will be completely under settler and Israeli control. So the Palestinians in the West Bank are already, even in a weaker position than they were prior to October 7th. And then, there are no signs. We talk about all the Palestinians in Jordan and the obvious anger among the Egyptian people, but there are no signs of any kind of uprising in either of those countries, not so far. There could be economic sanctions. You mentioned China. It's got a lot of economic leverage. Unfortunately, again, I think that maybe even if there was an effort, a worldwide effort to really punish or sanction Israel. Again, the U.S. would always be the exception to that, and we're giving them so many billions, every year right now, and that would just, if what would happen, it just immediately Congress would just double or triple that if there was real economic pressure put on Israel. So in the short run, I just don't see anything happening. Even if the world makes some significant steps to pressure Israel, it's just with the U.S. there, and I think in the near future anyway, in the near term, the Israelis know they can rely on the U.S. to support them no matter what.
Well, maybe this can help us segue into the economy a bit, because there's something that we said that is a possibility of potentially ending this genocide in the state of Israel is economic collapse here in the United States. And it feels like we're coming closer and closer to that. And I think, we're sending billions and billions in aid. If we are struggling more and more here in the United States and things start to really get bad, and there's no denying there's a real economic collapse, and then our Congress is just too busy just focusing on Israel, and they're having all these meetings about how many more billions we can get to support Israel, I think you're going to have a real problem here in the United States. It's already getting there, and I can see that happening. I mean, we're seeing this in Europe as well. Like their economies are collapsing, but they still seem to just be focusing on Ukraine. We can still send money to Ukraine, but we can't support our social programs, and this is going to cause a problem. So first of all, we'll just start with, do you think that an economic collapse is looming, and can it stop the genocide?
Okay, well, I think it's let's say a severe economic crisis is inevitable in this country. Again, the debt is just completely out of control. Spending is out of control, and it's out of control actually during an expansionary period of the economy. Now, in the past, when we had a more balanced economy, what would happen was that, during periods of economic sanction, the government would actually, draw down the debt to some extent, and would, maybe as if inflation started to rise, would raise interest rates. They had all these levers that they could use, and then when a recession would happen, which inevitably it would, every several years, then they would actually begin spending more. They would lower interest rates, and they would, and increase federal spending, and to restart the economy, and then we get out, and it's the same thing. Then they would begin to reduce the spending, start to build up maybe some kind of surplus, or at least reduce the debt. That right now we're in an expansionary period, and we're just spending like crazy. So what happens when we do go into a recession? We just don't have the usual tools, and already interest rates are down or very, very low, and there's an effort clearly on the part of the administration to lower them further still. We just won't even have the levers. The only thing that the government can do is actually to just straight out print money. And you're already printing so much that it seems to me that the consequence will be very high inflation. And this is at a time when the dollar is weakening. Again, that's something that's kind of helped us get through a lot of bad policy in the past. Other countries have to be more cautious about deficit spending and so on. We've gotten away with a lot of, unusually high levels of deficit spending over the last couple of decades because of the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. But it is losing that. Countries that used to, again, buy U.S. bonds, and in essence, by doing so would prop up the dollar. They're not doing it anymore, they haven't stopped entirely, but they have cut way back on their purchases. And these tariffs that Trump is slapping on the whole world is going to only exacerbate that problem. Because what's happened, it has to be admitted, a very unhealthy kind of relationship and, trade arrangement where we would buy, goods from around the world and they would buy our debt. and by doing that, would just, again, support our really, profligate spending in this country. But that is coming to an end in two ways, through the tariffs, or it's being, I can't say it's entirely ending, but that is going to be severely impacted, by the tariffs, and then also by just the decision on part of so many countries to actually, even prior to the tariffs, to reduce their purchases of U.S. debt. So when we go into a recession, and it's inevitable, we're just not going to have the same kind of levers, and we go into it already in a very kind of perilous state, a very fragile state. So it's going to be bad. I don't know that it will be the collapse, or it's just hard to predict with the economy. It probably would have already happened if it wasn't for the huge AI boom. Now, this is something that Paul Krugman, who I often disagree with, but he made this point recently. It's just like, it's the AI boom. Now, this is the thing where you have to be careful about making predictions to the economy, because things can happen that you just can't foresee. Nobody foresaw this AI boom. It's something that happened. But a lot of money is being invested in private companies and their productivity gains or whatever. And that at the moment is keeping Paul Krugman argues, the economy from collapsing, or from going into a severe recession. But that inevitably, these booms, like I remember the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s, they always, they come to an end. And when that will happen is anybody's guess. And it may, even the AI boom by itself might not be enough to stave off a recession. But we really are on the edge of a precipice here. And so when it happens, there will be an economic crisis, and people in this country will be more focused than ever on their pocketbooks, and will be more reluctant than ever to be sending billions of dollars overseas. There's no question about that. But as we've seen in Europe, in a way, Europe is ahead of us on that. Their economies are all suffering. But their leaders, Merz, and I think the worst perpetrators are in this regard are Merz and Starmer. It's just like they don't seem to give a damn. They're both very unpopular. because they have failed to deliver for their own people, but they just remain completely fixated on Ukraine and sending more support to Ukraine. Now, that seems to me unsustainable. Either these people are going to be thrown out, and you're going to eventually get political leaders and parties that end the support for Ukraine and begin to focus on the needs of the Europeans themselves, or you'll get authoritarian governments that just refuse to, because we see that happening already. They'll just refuse to leave power. They feel like, in the name of democracy, they have to stay where they are.
Right. That's a fear that I have, is that as an economic collapse looms, when the fiscal situation is so dire. I mean, just think about, we're 37 trillion in debt. And we are seeing an uptick in inflation now, and it sounds like Trump has convinced Powell to reduce the interest rate. So I have a feeling we're at the stage now where the debt's so high that and if we have inflation right now, and we're feeling pressure to lower the interest rate. Once you lower that interest rate, you're never raising it up again. Because that just the pain of raising that interest rate up when you have $37 trillion of debt is just way too high. So there's only one way we can go. So even when we're in a position now where we should be raising interest rates because we have inflation, we're going to be looking at lowering it. So I think we're screwed. But I mean, when it happens, is it going to happen, do you think, suddenly? And as it becomes apparent that there is this growing problem and the debt is unsustainable, and the only way to pay down the debt is either just start to hyperinflate, or just tax more and more out of your citizenry, do countries become more authoritarian, where we're going to see a increasing lockdown as it comes up to this collapse?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any sort of like logically necessary connection between authoritarianism and hyperinflation. But hyperinflation is very, let's say, extremely disruptive. I mean, it's and I think clearly undermines the legitimacy of all kinds of institutions. People just see like the normal rules of economic and social conduct, just become overthrown. You work and you get compensated for it. You save. We're already seeing kind of the whole idea of savings being undermined by these very, very low interest rates. Right? It used to be, I remember when I was a kid, that was basically like, most people did that. They put their surplus money in the bank, and then they accumulated interest, and the interest rate was maybe a little higher than the inflation rate. So they actually benefited from that. That's gone. Again, like the interest on savings accounts is just so absurdly low. You put your money in the bank and it shrinks, right? So what do people do? If you're working class, you're just screwed. If you're wealthy, you speculate in different kinds of assets, and the end result is that we have a growing gap between the owners of those assets and all the rest of the citizenry. And so, but anyway, all those problems would be exacerbated by hyperinflation. And so there's just a breakdown in the social contract, and then that can lead to all kinds of consequences. It does. It could, it provides opportunities for radical solutions, whether these are wise solutions or very dangerous and harmful solutions. That's both are possible. You're going to have all kinds of political entrepreneurs. They could be populist demagogues, or they could be, actually, maybe people, what we would hope for is somebody like the Thomas Masseys of the world, who are sane and understand what's going on, that they finally will be heard by more than their own constituents. But I think it's more likely that populist demagogues are going to win out.
How can we even say that the United States is a capitalist country when the most important asset of all is set by the state? It's the price of money, the interest rate. This is a huge problem. And I think many people don't. I've kind of just slowly realized it over time. Like, wait, this is crazy. The price of money is set by one man. Everybody gathers around to see what he says, and that dictates your consumption and investment decisions, everything. It's the price of your money. So it's just such a weird system that we look around and everybody prays and to Jerome Powell, cut the interest rate so whether I can the value of my assets are going to go up or whatever it is. It's just it's not set by the market. There should be a free market interest rate. And so like the idea of arguing about other parts of capitalism, I think is irrelevant when you don't have a capitalist society to begin with if you're dictating the price of the money. That undermines everything. So just like everything else is just noise. It's like, well, we're playing this stupid game where there's like 5 people that are in charge of our whole country that dictate the price of money, make all of our decisions. The federal government can just federalize your local police. You can slap tariffs on enemy bombing. But the idea that we're a democracy or a capitalist country or whatever, it's just all, they're all just names. The reality is we have this elite oligarch of a system that at the end of the day is filled with just people, and then there's about 5 people that make the decisions for the whole world. And it's messed up. We got stupid people in there.
Yeah. Well, they some of them may be very smart, but I think that the problem is, and I think that this is something that leftists need to understand, because in general, this is what the libertarians focus on, but leftists don't share this focus, on the Federal Reserve. I think it's because the leftists tend to say, well, actually printing money is good because it supports my social programs. But these people are not beholden to, the interests of the average person, and certainly not the worker. It's clear that they're concerned about, most of them, actually tend to come out of these very large, brokerage and investment firms in New York. They're part of the ultra wealthy class that cater, work for firms that cater to the ultra wealthy. And so when they're in there, they're making decisions that clearly actually support, they're concerned with those asset prices and, the stock market and other assets. And that's, it's always the stock market responds when you cut interest rates, there's always a rally. And you say, well, that's great. There's no downside to that. But of course there is a downside, because that's actually, okay, yeah, an increase in assets for those people that own assets, an increase in the value of assets for them. But for the rest of the country, it means inflation, because like you're actually pumping in money, and the money's actually going to the very wealthy, the asset owning class, and they're spending it raising the prices of everything, especially houses. And then somebody who's actually outside of that system and doesn't have, a significant amount of crypto or stocks or whatever, they just see like, the price of housing, it's just doubled in the last 5 years. And now I just can't do it. It's, and again, there's that gap that's growing, and it is a result of their policies. I think, and I think virtually now every country in the world does have a system like that, but I think maybe not every central bank has been so focused like our own, Federal Reserve has been focused on, maintaining asset prices.
Yeah, I just feel like the older I get, the more and more I feel like everything I've learned about my country's a lie. If it's a democracy, or it's capitalist, or just, that we're the good guys. And I just, now I'm just feeling like I'm becoming more and more at war with my own government, and it's just like going down this rabbit hole. I mean, is everything a lie? I mean, it's like, for example, let me ask you this then, like, for example, I know World War II isn't a lie, but I feel like a lot of the story, I feel like I've learned about World War II. I feel like it was molded in a way to serve Israel and the U.S. empire, and I feel like I didn't really get the full picture and understanding of everything. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we were, because this was just something that was elevated to godlike status. It became the religion of the United States. It became our raison d'etre, is just World War II, and this defined our morality. We're the good guys. We stopped the Nazis and that. Now I don't know. But now I'm just seeing the evil that this story is perpetrating. So
yeah. Well, maybe I'm a naive fool, but I think that all in all, we're on the side of right. Now, it's not quite so black and white as we make it out. Our side committed plenty of war crimes, the bombing of Dresden and the
No.
firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs,
Right.
et cetera. There's just no question about it. And then there was some, even like the deliberate starvation of Germans in the immediate aftermath of the war. There are a lot of, there's a lot of darkness involved. But I think all in all, again, maybe I'm just a fool. We were on the right side of this. But no question about it, it has been prettified and distorted and used over the years to justify, kinds of bad policies. And, part of it is the abuse of the Holocaust. We've got, a good person to go to that is Norman Finkelstein and the Holocaust industry. And, the truth be told, that was just a side issue and was not the focus of our fight in World War II. There was very little interest in like what was happening in the camps. But then also there is the fact that has been really played down and just denied, ignored, and especially in recent years, of the Soviet Union's dominant role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. By far, like something like 80% of the real fighting was done on the
Like
Eastern
83% of Germans died on the Eastern Front.
Front. Right. And again, the loss in the Soviet Union, which was largely Russian, paid the cost of that. 27 million dead. I think like 8 million, over 8 million soldiers, and the rest civilians. Um, So this is, but yeah, so we have played that fact because now we're making the Russians out to be evil, and then we always play up the Holocaust and use an excuse for, refusing to provide anything other than unconditional support for Israel. It's been greatly abused, and then there's always, as many have pointed out, it's just like it's always 1938, and it's like there's everything is refracted through a distorted historical lens and a distorted understanding of World War II. So like the main duty of the U.S. is never to appease, the so-called aggressor and, to always be on the lookout for the next Hitler and everybody, it was Saddam Hussein, now it's Putin and whatever. There's always these Hitlers that we have to, we cannot possibly negotiate or talk about because they're demonstrably evil and they're just bent on world conquest, and so we have to be very aggressive, and actually, not seek any kind of solution other than a military solution. And again, that's another way that our policy has been greatly distorted and with really horrible consequences. It's led to many wars. So World War II has been, our understanding of World War II has been abused by the people in power for a long time.
Do you think that this constant abuse will eventually destroy the story, the legacy of World War II? Because in a way, I feel like it's done that a bit for me already, and I think many other people.
I think it may for, people of your generation and younger. I think that's what we're seeing, that already they're not. So people of my age, I'm really an exception. I think are very much locked into that old narrative.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Very few of us, in my generation are able to escape it. But it doesn't have the hold on the younger generation. And I think that's clear.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I remember going to friends' houses, and every time I go there, it's always like the dad is on the couch watching History Channel World War II stories. Like it's just an unlimited amount of them. It's something that I feel like all dads, 50 or above, spent much of their life just consuming these World War II stories, just constantly. And some of them are great stories, and I think you should be very proud of them. But I'm starting to, the way I'm looking at it is like, we were fed that for a purpose, that we were be able to just to create the ultimate evil image of Hitler and the Nazis, and the focus on the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews, and that eternal victim status. I just feel like everything is being used to manipulate us now, that the state, history, schooling, and I don't know. I don't trust anybody anymore. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust anything. And I know that's not a great place for
Right,
a society to
right.
be, where you just
Yeah,
can't
no,
trust
I
anything.
agree. Well, I find the same thing. I would prefer to live in a society where I could trust. Now with a lot of things like health questions or whatever, before I would just completely trust the public health authorities. Now, I'm not saying that, there are people who go to the opposite extreme, like everything they say is a lie. I think maybe in general they're telling the truth, but I just don't know. And there's this skepticism which I wish I didn't have, but I have a skepticism about a lot of different things now, in regard to our, government institutions and other, leading institutions. And that, again, it shows, it's not just me and you, that's what the polls show, that there's just a general crisis of legitimacy. And it's unfortunately, like the people in power always want to blame the citizenry for this. It's, those ignorant, unwashed masses, they're the problem. And say, no, you got to stop and think about, the various lies that you've told and the inconsistencies. People notice it over time. And
Right.
that's really the cause of the crisis of legitimacy. Maybe sometimes the masses take things too far. I would say that's in the case of science, where a lot of people are just saying, oh, science is all bunk. And, that's not true. But there was a real abuse of scientific authority, during the COVID years, and that led a lot of people to become extremely skeptical. I think more skeptical than it's warranted. But those people in authority should stop and think, instead of pointing their finger at the masses, and say, yeah, wait a second, maybe we have to be careful about what we say, and really, not allow, our institutions to become, weaponized by political parties.
Yeah, I think part of it is just the gravity of the lies. If you are lying to us about Gaza and Palestine, that and you're trying to justify the starvation of a whole populations of millions of people, of women and children, if you're just so okay with killing people and lying about it just to kill people, then like, how can I trust you when you tell me about, that you care about our lives? It seems like our elites have no regard for human life. They're profit driven, or they're just captured, blackmailed, status driven, whatever it is. I don't think they care about us. I don't think they care about anybody. So I don't like if I don't trust you. If this is coming from my government, what's your motive? Because it seems like your motive isn't to take care of me or have my best interest. You clearly have no regard for human life, because I can see your support of what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's such a serious crime that, yeah, it does cast doubt on every other effort. That's the magnitude of it. And I think that's, again, we're seeing that throughout much of the world. It's just where there are many, many people throughout the world that were favorably disposed to the U.S. and inclined to trust the U.S. government. And that is evaporating because of this horrible crime in Gaza and our
Right.
complicity in it.
Yeah, no. When growing up, I mean, me, I would eat anything. I never look at the ingredients of any list, and I never really thought that stuff could be in our food could be bad, and that the FDA was always on top of things. But now, even then, I'm at the point now where I'm worried about the food that I give my kids, the food that I eat myself in this country. I never had that thought before, but now I just don't trust it. I don't trust what they put in any. I don't trust what they put into my news. I don't trust what they put in my food. I don't. It's just like yeah. So I mean, I guess society is just collapsing. We have an economic collapse. We're just being fed lie after lie, but the lies are being exposed, and people are becoming aware of it. So we're just becoming in sort of this post-truth state, and it's got to implode, right? I mean, and I
Yeah,
wanted.
well, right.
I needed
Well, again,
to.
I think it's the same thing. We've talked about how we are in a very poor position to handle some sort of severe recession. We don't have the surpluses. We don't have the higher interest rates that can be lowered. Whatever. We're going into a recession, with huge deficits and very low interest rates. So we just don't have the usual weapons. But you can say the same thing for we were just not well positioned to handle an economic crisis, quite the reverse. But it's the same thing for a social crisis. In the past, there was much greater trust in social and political institutions, and we had our crises, but we we went through them, we survived them. Like in the 60s. I mean, the 60s was really a crisis time, but we came through it, and the U.S. government remained, all in all, actually, retained this very strong support and the faith of the average citizen. But now we're, if we the faith, the confidence in institutions is so low that if we do have a real crisis, like an economic crisis, it's just that these institutions are again poorly positioned to actually kind of to lead us through. So there's just many more opportunities for new revolutionary or radical movements, and both good and bad, that can that can maybe really take root within the population that it wasn't really possible in the past. Again, it was just like, oh yeah, we're having a crisis, but please, people, we're working on it. And people by and large believed in the government, and we made it through. This time, I don't think people are going to believe.
Right. I think another big problem that we're going to have is just that the lack of social cohesion in this country. Listening to that podcast with Max Blumenthal and the Iranian woman, what struck me was the cohesion of the society. Like we mentioned before, that Iran was actually quite a diverse population in terms of thought and minorities, but after this attack, there was this unifying effect that we are in this together. We are Iranians. It doesn't matter, your religion or whatever it is. It's like we're in this. And I feel like here in the United States, there is no social cohesion. And so it just means chaos. Nobody's pulling together in one direction, either to get out of this or going deeper down the hole. It's just,
Yeah.
Tough times ahead, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It will be interesting.
Well, I mean, we were talking, I was just laying out what we hope could happen to end the genocide. So we've talked restart the war with missiles, hope for a nuclear bomb, hope for economic collapse. It's no good. I mean, obviously the solution we need is just for Donald Trump to say no more money, no more aid. But the only people in our government are Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey that seem to be doing anything.
A couple others on the Democratic side too. I mean,
that's true. I've been seeing them more just because they've been very vocal, and it's great to see it coming from the right,
Yeah, right. But they're actually more on the left, not a whole lot more. Again, the real dissidents are very, very few. We're talking like 4 or 5 on the left side of the spectrum. So, but yeah, more power to them, on whatever side of the aisle they're on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we can probably end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Yeah, want any parting words for us?
Yeah, well, next time we can focus more. I was just thinking maybe we need a battle line update on what's happening in Russia. Interesting things are always happening there, but there's just too much to really cover
right
in one episode.
Something going on in Kupiansk, is that what's happening? Or
well, last I heard, there may be some breaking news that I missed, but actually this happened a few days ago. The Russians are actually in Kupiansk, so that's. Yeah, that's the thing. It's actually there's so much happening that you can't keep track of it. It's just like everybody's focused on Pokrovsk, which is probably the most important battle. But there are, Kupiansk, for example, is the size of Avdiivka, and remember that was the one battle a year and a half ago that everybody was focused on. Now we have approximately 3 or 4 battles of equal importance going on at the same time. And so that tells you, the war has expanded. The Russian offensive, her Russian advances have accelerated. Again, it used to be, we would talk about one village would fall a week, and now there's villages every day. It used to be this only one city at a time was under siege. Now there are 3 or 4 at the same time under siege.
Okay, well, we'll dive into that on Wednesday then.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, you too. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.